Okay, the broadcast is live now. The broadcast is live. Okay, so I'll start out with the explanation, and then we'll ease out on to the lectures and the translation. Okay, good afternoon, boa tarde a todos. I'm going to speak in Portuguese first, and I'll go back to English, okay? Boa tarde a todos. Nós estamos aqui num webinar de uma ação conjunta do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Direito da Universidade Católica de Pernambuco e da Escola Judicial do Tribunal Regional do Trabalho da Sexta Região, Diálogos Internacionais do PPGD UNICAP e da Escola Judicial do TRT6, Impactos da pandemia nas relações de trabalho além-mar. And we're now going to start our international dialogues with the postgraduate program of the Catholic University of Pernambuco and the Judicial School of the 6th Regional Labor Court here in Brazil. And we are going to talk about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on labor relations overseas. And I'll be speaking first in Portuguese, then I'll get back to speaking in English, ok? Então, eu vou voltar agora a falar em português. Nós temos, então, um público misto aqui. Nós vamos ter uma tradução simultânea, pelo menos vamos tentar uma tradução simultânea, que vai ser disponibilizada por meio da conta no Instagram da Escola Judicial, da EJTRT6. Então, em alguns minutos, eu vou pedir para aqueles que precisam da tradução para utilizar, e nós vamos fazer um esforço para tentar promover uma tradução durante o decorrer desse evento. Inicialmente, eu quero agradecer tanto a coordenação do Programa de Pós-Graduação da Universidade Católica de Pernambuco, nas pessoas do professor Raimundo Juliana e da professora Érica Babini, e do presidente do Tribunal Regional do Trabalho da Sexta Região, o Dr. Valdir Carvalho, e o diretor da Escola Judicial do TRT6, o desembargador Ivan Valença, pela ajuda, auxílio e apoio na realização desse respectivo evento. E não posso esquecer também nosso querido amigo Rodrigo Samico, coordenador da escola, e também toda a equipe de apoio, destacando o Pedro, que está nos auxiliando aqui. Então, nós vamos realizar da seguinte forma. Eu vou, então, fazer uma apresentação dos respectivos professores que vão falar aqui em inglês, e, em seguida, o professor Robert vai começar a fazer a sua exposição. Eu, então, vou sair do áudio aqui e irei, então, para fazer a tradução dentro do Instagram da respectiva escola, só para que vocês, então, possam fazer o respectivo acompanhamento. Então, o que eu vou fazer agora é apresentar os nossos dois palestrantes estrangeiros, bem como o nosso palestrante local, o professor Marcelo Labanca, e aí, então, eu sairei para que esse evento possa prosseguir inteiramente em inglês aqui pelo YouTube e com a tradução, para quem se interessar, pelo Instagram da escola. O que eu aconselho é que quem for utilizar a tradução, baixe ao máximo o som no YouTube para não ficar atrapalhando você, e você escute a tradução enquanto o respectivo palestrante estiver falando, ok? Então, essa nossa tentativa, então, de atender às necessidades de todas as pessoas, tanto os que querem ouvir inglês, como aqueles que querem ouvir em português, ok? Okay, I was just explaining that we're going to share this event both in English and in Portuguese. We'll have translation later on, and I will go into the Instagram account of our judicial school to give the translation. But right now, we are going to start this event, and I am just extremely happy and emotional for us to have such great professors here with us, such great speakers. This is our first international event in this format, international format, and we have speaking with us today, Professor Robert Williams from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and Dr. Elaine Williams, who is a lawyer working mainly in the northeast of the U.S., mainly in Pennsylvania, where she has a law firm and she works usually in the labor area, in labor relations and with unions. And here from Brazil, we have from the Catholic University of Pernambuco, Professor Marcelo Labanca, who's also a public attorney, and he will be working as a sort of debater, moderator during the respective events. So we will start out with a lecture with Professor Robert. He is a professor in constitutional law, specialized in state constitutions in the United States. We were very privileged to have him here in Brazil, in Recife last year, where I had the opportunity to meet him personally. And so he will give us a general view of what the United States is facing during this COVID pandemic and eventual friction that we might see between states and the federal government in the US. So we can then have a comparison to what we are having here in Brazil. And so now I will give the floor to Professor Robert, and he will start his speech, and I will mute out here from speaking English, and I will start the translation. Okay, I'll be watching you, Robert. I please ask, if you can, to speak slowly with some pauses. I used to be a translator when I was a lot younger, when I was going to college, but it's been quite a while, so I'm probably very rusty. But I'll try my best to translate and try to help our Brazilian viewers. Okay? Thank you so very much, Robert, for accepting our invitation. Let me just clear things up right now. Elaine and Robert are married, okay? And so they are not violating any of the social distancing rules right now. They're sitting next to each other, okay? But they are in confinement together. Is that true, Robert?
That's exactly true.
Okay, so we're not breaking any rules here. They are husband and wife, so that is why they are next to each other. Well, Robert will speak first, and then Elaine will speak later on, and she'll have a view on some labor questions and the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic on labor relations. So right now we will start with Robert. Okay, Robert? So I'm going to mute out here, and I will go, and you please have the floor. Marcelo is going to help me out, and if you need anything, you can talk to Marcelo, and afterwards Marcelo will ask you some questions, okay? Pessoal, então agora eu vou fazer a tradução. O professor Robert Williams, da Universidade de Rutgers, vai falar. Ele é professor de Direito Constitucional, especializado na área de constituições dos Estados americanos. Esteve aqui no Brasil ano passado, então já conhece o nosso país, especificamente aqui em Recife. Enquanto eu estiver fora, o meu querido amigo e irmão, o Marcelo, vai conduzir os respectivos trabalhos. Eu estarei fazendo, então, a tradução pelo Instagram da respectiva escola, ok? Então, quem quiser ouvir em português, pode entrar, EJTRT6, e eu vou iniciar, então, daqui uns 30 segundos. Ok, Marcelo? Então, pode falar e depois você manda o professor Robert falar. Eu vou só sair daqui agora enquanto ao som.
Obrigado, Sergio. We remember with such great fondness our visit to Recife last year, and we both had a wonderful visit there, and we learned a tremendous amount about Brazilian state institutions. I've been asked today to give a very brief report about the initial stages in the United States of the relationship between the coronavirus and American constitutionalism. And this relationship between the pandemic and our constitutional structure will have some parallels, I think, to the situation there in Brazil, because, of course, we both live and worked in federal countries, which are structured to have both a federal or national government, but also governments of the sovereign states. And so we know in a federal system, we have both political relationships and legal constitutional relationships. And on the political side, very quickly, the federal system can operate either as a cooperative federalism or in conflict. And interestingly, here in the United States, we've had some of both of those things. So looking at the response to the pandemic from the top down, or from the federal government looking either down or over at the states, however you like to imagine it, we have had both cooperation and conflict. This has been in the news with our president criticizing the states for various aspects of their response to the pandemic, while at the same time, we have various criticisms from the state governors and state officials about the national response. So this has really been federalism in conflict, pointing fingers back and forth at each of the sovereign governments and pointing out the failures that each of them have made in responding to this terrible crisis. You would not have this in a country that was not based on federalism, because you wouldn't have state political systems that are elected and they're competing for approval with the national government. But we in the United States have this, as well as you in Brazil and a number of other South American countries like Argentina. But of course, federal systems can also operate on the basis of cooperation. And we have plenty of that example here in America as well. So the national government has been very effective in organizing the medical research, providing information to the people in the states, even involved in gathering up the material that's necessary for safe medical care. So this is the masks, the ventilators, the gloves, all of those things that have been in very short supply here in our country. And so this is, by the same token, the governors and the states have been very cooperative with the national government in terms of coordinating their efforts, and particularly in supplying data to the federal government, so that the federal government has a good picture in real time of what's going on in the states. So I think this is true to say about Brazil as well. You probably have examples of both cooperation and conflict between your federal government and your states. And that's, of course, very common in federal countries. Just the last little piece of this is we also have competition among the states, not up and down with the federal government, but horizontally, between the states. So the states have competed in the marketplace to purchase this equipment. We call it PPE, personal protective equipment. So some of them have actually been bidding against other states, both in the United States and overseas, to purchase these materials. Again, I don't think you would have this in a country that was not based on federalism. So the next element of our constitutional response to the pandemic is that the primary competence over health and local business regulation in our country resides with the states. So the most interesting and important constitutional law matters that have arisen, of course, we're very early in this, but we've already seen constitutional law matters coming up. They're mostly in the states so far. We don't really have much in the way of federal constitutional matters going on. I'll return to that right at the end of my remarks. But so the most important state constitutional issue that's going on in the United States has to do with the powers of governors. And of course, these are slightly different in all of our 50 states. I think that's a little different in Brazil, where your state governments are a little bit more uniform in comparison to the national government. But we have different states where governors have different powers. But let me make a general comment about this question, and that is, do state governors have the power to close businesses and order people to stay home? And so far, that's actually been to court already in several states, primarily in Pennsylvania. And there, some of the businesses brought a lawsuit against the governor, arguing that the governor was making law himself rather than enforcing existing law. And this is a very important distinction, because our governors, like our president, are charged with implementing or executing the law that's already on the books. And they can't make law on their own, just like our president cannot make law on his own. And so these cases have to do with, where does the state governor get the authority to order people to stay home, or in some ways, more importantly, to order businesses to close? And just in the last several weeks, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upheld the state governor's power to order businesses to close and to order people to stay home. And the grounds for that decision were that the state constitution gives the governor the exclusive power to enforce the law, okay? And if you take a look at what law was already enacted in Pennsylvania, there are a number of laws that delegated or empowered the governor to take emergency steps in the face of a crisis, like a pandemic. So the argument that the governor did not have the power to do this failed in Pennsylvania, because there are already laws that authorized the governor to act. So the governor really was simply enforcing those laws for the public safety. Now, it's interesting, that's really not a constitutional individual rights argument. It's a government powers argument. But in our country, often a rights argument, the government cannot do this to me, is also based on the government doesn't have the power to do that to me. So this case I'm mentioning in Pennsylvania was decided on the first ground. The governor has the power to do that, to close businesses and make people stay at home. The next step was, does this violate the liberty, or we say due process rights of the business owners in the same case? It's just two sides of the same coin, we say. And in that, the court said, no, in an emergency situation, you don't have unlimited liberty rights to do what you want if you're going to endanger other people. So this feels to me like a common sense decision in the middle of a crisis that makes sense both in general terms and in constitutional law. So that's the major issue that's been going on around the country. There are a number of these cases that are going on, but interestingly, they're all state constitutional law cases and will be decided based on the law of the individual states. There's a couple of other matters that are going on in the states. I didn't mention this, but when the governors order businesses to close, they include in those orders an exception for businesses that are important to healthcare or ongoing life, such as groceries, food, those kinds of things. There's been an argument raised, interestingly, that the governor back in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin was unfair in developing those categories. In other words, you have a number of businesses that say, well, we're also important to life, particularly liquor stores that want to sell alcohol. They claim to be important to ongoing life. So that can be a constitutional law case about unfair classifications of businesses that are considered important enough to stay open despite the emergency, or those that are must close. So the fairness argument there gets translated into a constitutional law argument. There's also a similar state constitutional argument about governors' power to execute particular laws, to bring them into enforcement, and even to sometimes change them according to their emergency powers. So we have a case developing in New Jersey here where the governor has issued an executive order, we call it, saying that tenants, people who are renting apartments or houses, can use their security deposit. I think you have a similar situation in Brazil, to pay their rent if they're unemployed. And of course, a huge percentage of our country is unemployed now. But that goes directly against a state law. So that may be an example of a governor claiming to assert a constitutional power that's really not there, because governors are really not allowed to change law. They're only allowed to implement it or execute it. Look at my time here. Let me say a word. One last thing in the States. The treatment of prisoners, people who are in prison, have a constitutional right to be treated safely and without what we call cruel and unusual punishment. And there are a lot of cases about conditions in prisons. Have to be careful about the safety of those in the prisons, as well as the guards. And those cases are coming up now as constitutional cases, both under the U.S. Constitution and under the state constitutions. None of them have been decided yet, but there's a lot of examples where the jails and the prisons are not being very careful about the spread of this virus within these prison facilities, where people are put together in cells and in eating and in exercising in very close quarters. So it's going to be interesting to see how those cases come out, but they'll take longer to work through the courts, and they may involve cases with inmates who have died. So we'll see how that turns out. I want to say one more thing now about our federal Constitution, looking top down about its response to the pandemic. Our national Constitution gives specific powers to the federal government. We call them enumerated or specified powers. And many people know that over the years, the United States Supreme Court has looked at those powers pretty loosely, and they've been expanded over the years. But the truth is, the federal government has no direct power to deal with health and safety in the states, or to tell hospitals and doctors and local businesses, let alone people, whether they can leave their houses. So people might ask, what is the role of our federal government on these issues that are taking place mostly out in the states? Well, it's interesting. Our federal constitution also grants a power to the federal government to spend money for the general welfare. So it turns out, even though the national government could not pass laws directly on health and safety matters in the states or employment matters in the states that my wife will talk about a little bit later, it can grant money to the states that comes with conditions or requirements for the expenditure of the money. And so through this mechanism, completely constitutional, the federal government has enacted laws granting trillions of dollars to states, local governments, and private businesses. And within those grants of money come these conditions, some of which even require the states to change some of their laws, such as those dealing with unemployment compensation. And the states have to do this in return for getting the money. So it's a sort of common relationship, I think, that many people would recognize. Here, I'll give you money, but you have to do this. So that's the way so far that our federal government has gotten involved in very important ways in dealing with this pandemic. And just even now, some of that money is being expended to businesses, private individuals who are unemployed, and others in a way that the states and local governments could never afford. But the national government, with its federal income tax, and by the way, no requirement to have a balanced budget, states couldn't spend that kind of money. It'd been impossible. The last related matter I want to mention is the states, back to the state constitutions, they have a requirement of a balanced budget. They're not like the federal government in our country, which can engage in deficit spending. So the early figures in the states are, because of the massive unemployment and massive shortage of business operations, the tax collections in the states, the revenues in the states are down by 40%, almost overnight in a period of 6 weeks. That's catastrophic for state budgets. And I assume it's the same way in Brazil. And so how is a state going to continue the operations it's had in the past with a 40% reduction in revenues coming in and a requirement that it have a balanced budget, meaning that it can only appropriate or spend the amount of money that is taken in? And again, this doesn't apply to our federal government. So these requirements of balanced budget are in the state constitutions. What are we going to do about that? So it's interesting. I've looked at this in only one state, but our state constitution has all kinds of requirements for the balanced budget and limitations on borrowing money. This would be the first response, I think, to an emergency like this. Let's borrow the money and pay it back over some future years. Our Constitution in New Jersey does not let us do that unless we have a vote of the people to, as we say, incur that debt that would be paid off by future generations. But interestingly, the drafters of our state constitution about 30 years ago put a provision in saying you don't have to have a vote of the people if there's a crisis caused by an act of God. So we think we may be able to work with our state constitution here in New Jersey to get around this apparent constraint. So to me, that's another example of American constitutionalism in the time of a pandemic. So I think I may, my watch stopped over here, so I may have exceeded my time, but I think Marcelo may want to follow up on some of this or probe in a few other directions about American constitutionalism and the pandemic? Marcelo?
Yeah, listen. Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay, I was just switching on my microphone. It's my first time here in this live, like with Sergio, and I would like to. I'm glad to be here, in fact, and see you again, Bob. That we was last year together here in Brazil, and also with Elaine, and it's for me a really great pleasure to be here and to be able to contribute to this debate. Seeing you again and two lovely friends, and also Sergio, that we work together at the university, and it's a great professor and also a great judge. And this is a huge initiative, by the way, from the School of the Judiciary, Labor Judiciary. Well, Bob, let me see some questions that you had spoken, and I've written here something about this. I listen you very carefully, and I like to say that currently here in Brazil, we are also going through this very difficult moment, and it's precisely, I think so, in these moments that we have the opportunity to look at what are we doing, and also to look for what we can do better. And this is such a great point in the subject of the federalism, and the way of we can see the way to see the federalism by the courts. And I think so that we are with a great opportunity. Please let me say this, because it's a difficult moment, but we have an opportunity to equalize some rules that we have here in Brazil in this fight between state level and federal level, and also one state that can also not collaborate with others, but do such as of competition. And well, we have been observing that since always that was a centralized tendency of the courts to interpret the conflict between laws and between federal and state levels, but always in favor of the federal level here in Brazil. This is a point. The Brazilian Supreme Court always sees the federalism like with a centralized point of view, and it's now we are seeing such a changing this point of view by the courts. Why? Because we have a problem between the federal and state governments, and also between state governments, between states among themselves. And also we have an issue inside, like the internal issue, when the governor can make rules, executive rules, and maybe it should be done by the parliament, the state parliament. And we are actually watching a great change when the judiciary, the judge, they are deciding in favor of the lower level, the state levels, and also in favor of those executive rules, saying that this is not, we are not breaking the rule of law. This is almost, I think, the same points that we have here in Brazil and also in the United States. But in addition of these positions of the state courts, and that you said the Pennsylvania State Court, and I think was it Pennsylvania. You told us about you talked to us about the position of the state, the judgments of the state courts. But I'd like to hear from you how the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, has been dealing with this competence dispute. And another question that I can make. We also have here a great problem in the prisons that you mentioned it, but we have also a problem with the minority, like indigenous, and they have like such a kind of protection or more protection from the state. And I'd like to hear also from you if in the United States you have this problem with different level of protection that can be held from one state to another. Those 2 points. That's what I want to listen from you, if you can, of course, give us a little bit more of your talk.
Certainly, I'm happy to, Marcelo. Thanks very much. The first question is a very interesting one in our country, because everybody assumes that the major questions, I know you know the difference, but most people think, oh, well, every big question will go to the famous United States Supreme Court. It's interesting that a lot of these questions about the power of governors and their relationship to state legislatures are pure questions of state law. And the way the United States Supreme Court is set up in the Constitution, it has no authority to decide pure questions of state law. So on most of these matters, there would be no authority. Say the Pennsylvania case, can the governor shut businesses? That's a pure question of state law under the state constitution. And the United States Supreme Court has been very clear over the years that it agrees that it has no authority to decide those kinds of cases. It's not quite that simple, though.
Yeah.
The challengers, the business owners who wanted to open, are able to make a federal constitutional claim about their liberty or equal treatment or whatever, and they can invoke a federal constitutional claim, which of course the United States Supreme Court does have authority to decide. So I have to say, I have not seen that that's been done yet.
Yet.
Case, because this is all happening so fast. But there's another example I'll mention of this relationship between the state law and the United States Supreme Court decisions. Just last month, the what we call the primary election for president was scheduled to take place in Wisconsin, and yet there was still quarantine and stay-at-home orders. Businesses were closed. And the question was, should the election go on as scheduled? And there was a disagreement about that between the Republicans and the Democrats, between the legislature and the governor. So the legislature decided not to postpone the election, to go ahead and have the election, even though people weren't supposed to come out and they weren't supposed to get together in big crowds. Next, the governor said, no, I will postpone the election. And so there was a very fast court case within about 3 or 4 days. and it went from the trial court all the way to the United States Supreme Court in maybe 5 days. And what happened was you would think that's just a question of state law. So the US Supreme Court wouldn't have any authority over it. But these two sides went not only to state court, but to federal court. And a federal judge, a single federal judge, said the election should be postponed and votes that seemed to be coming in late should be counted. That was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, I think in the same day. It's interesting, very exciting kinds of court cases. And the US Supreme Court ruled that the election should go on as scheduled. So that's American constitutional law in all of its glory, very fast. And it turned out, many of us thought politically, the reason the Republican legislature did not want to postpone the election was because they thought the Republican candidate would win. This was not a presidential election, but another election going on in Wisconsin. Turned out the Democrat won. So the political side of it came out the way the losing party on the legal claim wanted it, but the Democrats won anyway. But normally these questions in the states would not come to the United States Supreme Court at all, which is a big surprise to a lot of people, both within the United States and outside the United States. Your question about minority protection, we do have that in the states, and it's interesting. I think it's like Brazil, that the different states have different minorities in them. So our southwestern states, for example, New Mexico, Arizona, New Mexico has a right in its constitution to what we call bilingual education. People, children in New Mexico have a state constitutional right to education in both English and Spanish. Not true I don't think in any other states. A number of the states have what we call an equal rights amendment. I mean, women are not really a minority, but they've been treated like a minority in most of our countries. We don't have an equal rights amendment for women in our federal constitution. It was very close 25 years ago, but it didn't make it. We have it in 16 or 18 states. So even though women aren't a minority, they've sort of been treated like that. So they have special protection in some of the states. Again, people with disabilities are thought to be a minority. Excuse me. And not very many, but some of the states more recently have inserted constitutional protections in their state constitutions. Finally, I think the state of Alaska has constitutional protections for we call native peoples or indigenous peoples tribes. But it's like much of our state constitutional system. It depends on the states, and they're all a little bit different. I hope that answered your questions, Marcella.
Yeah, Bob. I was just wondering if it's possible to establish a greater protection for minorities during this pandemic period, like how to access the hospitals or something like that. Because when you have I don't know how you are dealing with this in Pennsylvania, but here in Pernambuco we have we don't have too much like beds in hospitals for everyone. And if it's possible to state government or to in the state the state's laws make rules about a major protection for minorities, I was just wondering if
Very
if that
interesting
is
question.
possible.
Yeah, a great question. At least it's true in our country that African American people, Latino people, I think it's true for women as well, are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. These are people who are most likely not to be able to work from home. So they have to continue to work, driving buses, working in grocery stores, in the case of women, working in hospitals, things like that. So they're affected by the virus more than white men are. Now, people are just beginning to recognize that in the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's a lot of discussion of it. But I think what would happen if there was an attempt to make a legal distinction so that, luckily, we have not been turning people away from beds in hospitals very much in this country, a little bit in New York, I think. But if we tried to make a legal rule that, say, minority people or women would get affirmative action for those beds, I worry that that might not be constitutional. That might be seen as unconstitutional discrimination against white men. I'm not sure. I had not thought of it until you asked the question. But it calls out for an answer because it's very disproportionate. This crisis has hit poor people who in our country tend to be African American, Latino, and certainly women. It's hit them much more heavily. So they're paying a heavier price. I'm not sure what we could do about that in our country. It's a very important question.
Okay, Bo, thank you very much.
Thank
Pleasure.
you. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to coming back to Brazil if I can. Thank you.
Yes, sooner. Thank you.
Oh, wait.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can, but
Okay, Elaine, let me just give an explanation, and I'm going to say sorry to our public because, you know, I'm a dinosaur. I'm Jurassic, and I don't know how to play with all these different smartphone things. And so when I was translating, originally I said I would be translating through the Instagram of the school. I don't know how, but I started translating through my Instagram, you know. But then they put that sign there on the floor, and it says that my Instagram number. So I think the people got there later, and I have to say sorry to the general public that my translation probably took longer to get to them, you know. And so I'm gonna say I'm sorry first, and then I'll go back. Então, eu vou falar agora em português. Inicialmente eu pedir perdão e desculpas pela essa falha técnica, porque quando eu entrei no Instagram da escola e fui fazer a tradução, nós acreditávamos que sairia pelo Insta da escola e acabou saindo pelo meu Instagram, que está aí embaixo, estou vendo agora na tela. E aí, então, eu peço 1000 perdões por isso. Eu assumo toda a culpa. Eu estava dizendo para a Line que eu sou jurássico, não tenho domínio das novas tecnologias como eu gostaria de ter. E meu assessor de TI, né, o meu filho, não está aqui na sala comigo ainda. Eu acho que vou cortar metade da mesada dele, Marcelo, né, porque ele poderia, se ele tivesse me falado isso antes, mas a culpa foi minha, não foi culpa dele, não, foi culpa minha mesmo. Então, eu peço 1000 perdões, né, a quem está nos assistindo. Então, quando eu voltar a fazer a tradução, se eu conseguir voltar a acertar lá, espero conseguir, será então pelo Instagram que está ali embaixo. Mas eu peço 1000 perdões por essa falha técnica que fugiu ao nosso controle. Eu vou, então, agora, né, me dirigir à Line, fazer a apresentação dela. Ela é uma advogada trabalhista cujo escritório se localiza na Pensilvânia. Ela é casada com o professor Robert, mas ela atua como advogada mesmo. E ela é uma das advogadas trabalhistas mais famosas dos Estados Unidos na área, né, específica da área sindical. Ela atuava muito nessa área. Então, ela esteve aqui no Brasil ano passado. Eu tive a oportunidade de a conhecer. O Marcelo a apresentou para mim e nós discutimos realmente só sobre questões trabalhistas lá nos Estados Unidos. E nós achamos muito interessante ela poder, então, dar essa visão envolvendo os impactos da pandemia sobre as relações de trabalho nos Estados Unidos. Então, eu vou agora falar inglês, inicialmente fazendo basicamente essa apresentação, e aí, quando eu sair, né, qualquer coisa o Marcelo assume, e eu voltarei ali para tentar continuar aquela tradução no Instagram como estava antes, ok, doutores? Eu peço até quando eu sair, Marcelo, você fica só um minuto conversando com ela antes dela iniciar, tá bom? Só para dar tempo para eu entrar para fazer a tradução, certo? Só 30 segundos. Dá um delay aí.
Eu converso com ela...
Só um negócio rápido, 1 minuto só para dar tempo para eu entrar, ok?
Porque você vai entrar na escola você vai entrar no Insta da escola, é isso?
Eu vou entrar no Instagram para fazer a tradução. Eu vou apresentar ela agora, certo? E aí depois, quando eu voltar para fazer as perguntas, aí vamos deixar de lado o Instagram e eu faço as perguntas em inglês e traduzo imediatamente em português essa última parte, tá bom? Ok? Então vamos fazer assim, deixa eu fazer a apresentação. Okay, Elaine, I'm going to speak in English now. Sorry, I was just giving like the technical explanations to everyone. This is the first time we're doing it. I asked everyone for their patience, you know, but I think we're doing our best at least. Okay, Dr. Elaine Williams is a famous lawyer in the United States, specializes in labor relations, both individual labor relations and collective labor relations involving unions and syndicates. She is a wonderful lady, truly remarkable in terms of intelligence. You know, I had dinner with her and her husband Robert last year, and I was just so blown out of the water. It was just so incredible. The talk I had, maybe an hour and a half, and I learned more than I had learned maybe in the last 10 years in terms of labor law in the U.S. So so very happy that Elaine accepted our invitation, and so she can share her experience. She's going to talk a little bit about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on labor relations in the U.S. And so I will leave now. Marcelo will talk to you for about 30 seconds to 1 minute while I go do my translation. That is fun. We call it here, Elaine, we call this like acúmulo de funções, which is like accumulation of functions or of jobs. I'm doubling now. I'm moonlighting.
You're doing everything, right?
Yeah. Now I'm going to go right now and get translated, okay?
Right.
So I'll mute myself now, and I'll be there. Marcel will take over for 1 minute. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, Elaine. It's because Sergio is all. It's like he's doing the translation. What we're speaking here in English, and he goes to his Instagram and says like in Portuguese, what are we talking here? So, but Sergio is it's like an American. He's
more efficient than an American.
Yeah, of course, and also a great professor. And here it's like a great friend. How can we say this in the United States? He has a great heart, a huge, a big heart. Huh?
Indeed. He's he never ceases to amaze me. He's a judge. He's teaching at 2 universities. So we can barely handle doing one job here. Much not to mention 3.
Yes, and I think he's finishing there. So you can begin like 1 minute or like. He was reminding us that dinner that we had last year here in Recife.
It was a lovely dinner. We had so many lovely dinners in Brazil. it's quite, I don't think that there was a missed meal, and all of the meals were fabulous. So
Yeah.
we can't wait to return.
Yeah, Recife, we are very proud of ourselves here.
Right. So were you able to get Carnival in before the virus came to?
Yeah. Thanks God. Yes. Thanks God.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Didn't
Because
show
Carnival,
up.
Yeah, Carnival here is very important. It's very important for us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And after after 1 month, maybe less, 1 month, it begins all this pandemic, and everybody now stays at home, and we can't. Well, I wonder if Carnival was 1 month before or 1 month after.
Good. Okay, so
it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen.
It wouldn't happen now, right?
It wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And we have also a festivity here in Brazil, in northeast of Brazil. It's Saint John. I don't know. We call here Festa de São João, and it's a Catholic event, and also a popular festivity with all in all northeast. If you go to Rio and to São Paulo, you don't see this.
You don't see it, but you
don't hear about this. But it is not gonna happen because it's here. It's in June. It's gonna be next month. It's not gonna happen. All those shows are being cancelled.
Yeah, it was like our Easter. I mean, we were all home for Easter. All the church services were broadcast through Facebook or wherever, but no church was open in the United. Well, at least where we are, no church was open.
No church. No church.
No church for Easter, which was what, like April 10th or something like that. So
yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, they did it. Our church did it through Facebook. So there was. So you got a service, one singer, the minister, but it is what it is.
Okay. So Sergio, it's ready. So we're gonna begin.
Okay, good.
Okay, you can begin, Elaine. Thank you very much for to be with us in this moment.
It is,
and it's a difficult moment, but we are now together, and you can begin your talk.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. It's really quite an honor to have this opportunity, and it's an honor to be the first international broadcast you're doing. So we hope that there will be more international broadcasts after we do this one. So in terms of my involvement in the coronavirus and COVID-19 and how it has impacted has very much to do with the fact that I've spent my entire legal career as a labor lawyer, primarily representing labor unions. And so when the virus hit in the United States, the big issues for me all involved the impact on working people in the United States and what impact that would have not only on workers, but on their families and on the labor unions or syndicates that represent them. To get a little bit of perspective, we are in a part of the United States that is very seriously affected by the virus. As of this morning, there's over 1 million cases in the United States, but they're also broken down by states. So, for example, in Brazil right now, you have, according to the data I've seen, 87,000 cases as of today. In Pernambuco, they're about little under 7,000, 6,800 cases. In my little state of New Jersey, which is right next to Pennsylvania, but a relatively small state, we have 118,000 cases and over 7,000 people have died. So we have been very, very badly affected. A lot of the New Jersey cases are because New Jersey, of course, abuts New York, and New York City has been very badly hit, although the cases have really gone through most of the entire state. Pennsylvania is similar, has a lot of cases, but nowhere near as many as New Jersey. Other parts of the United States have very few cases, and that's partly why you hear so much about why should restrictions exist in every single state when some states don't have that many cases. The result of the virus hitting in the United States is that state governments and so state governors and mayors of big cities took action to try to close down the states, to force social distancing. And in Pennsylvania, the governor issued a state of an emergency, I think it was around March 19th, where he declared stay at home and prohibited all but essential essential private employers to continue to operate. The result of this is that it caused massive unemployment. Obviously, within most of the jobs in the United States, there are many operations where one can work from home. So, for example, lawyers can work from home. Teachers, in many instances, law professors can work from home. But restaurant workers, workers in retail, workers in construction, they can't work from home. And so most of those people, or many of those people, lost their jobs in a fairly quick order. One day we were open and one day we were closed. And unlike other instances where there's an immediate closing, it usually related to an event that would have a beginning and an end, like a hurricane or a huge snowstorm where there's some warning it's coming, the event occurs, and then there's aftermath from the event, and then things return to normal. That has not been the case here. We have all essentially been home since around March 20th, which is a considerable period of time. The result is that there has been closure of businesses, except for businesses that are deemed to be essential. And that, of course, becomes an issue of what is an essential business and what isn't. Because of the massive unemployment, the Congress took action fairly early on. I think it was on early in mid-March. Congress passed the first statute that dealt with employees being forced to stay home, and they passed what was called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which granted all employees who were impacted by the virus an immediate 10 days of paid sick leave. And this was above and beyond any sick leave that they might have through their employment as a result of collective bargaining or as a result of any contracts that they may have entered into with their employer. It additionally granted leave for employees who had to stay home because their children were out of school and they had to care for their children. This first statute was thought to be quite dramatic because what happened when they closed down essential businesses is they closed most of the schools in the United States. And when schools in the United States closed down, no one had anyone to watch their children. And because of social distancing, people were encouraged to tell their housekeepers or their nannies or babysitters to cease coming to their homes. So suddenly everybody was in the house together. For example, my Bob and I have, our children are both lawyers, and they're practicing law. One of them with two very small children underfoot. They're practicing law at home remotely. The first statute that was passed was important because it granted employees paid sick leave, but only 80 hours of paid sick leave or 2 weeks of paid sick leave. And it granted, it had a similar grant of leave for parental to care for children, but it was at a lower rate of pay. That was then followed by one of the other things the first statute did is it required health plans to provide testing at no cost to the employee. In the United States, healthcare is a multi-level benefit that is usually negotiated. It is often offered through your employment, and employers pay for the healthcare, but employees also pay for that healthcare. There is no national healthcare in the United States. And it is not unusual that when one goes to the doctor, one has a $25 copay if one is going to have a test of some sort. The first statute prohibited any insurance companies from charging individuals for any of those tests. So it was important. The other thing it did, though, however, was it excluded first responders and healthcare workers, which of course raised lots of issues because first responders being police officers, firefighters, ambulance drivers, corrections officers, any of those people who are in a position where they're going to be exposed, none of them were covered by that original statute. And additionally, anyone who worked in a hospital or in a nursing home, they weren't impacted by the statute. Subsequently, a couple of weeks later, Congress passed what was called the CARES Act, or the Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And the CARES Act attempted to bring some additional benefits to out-of-work employees. The first component of it was a stimulus check to individuals. So if you met certain financial criteria, which were relatively high, you would receive a check for $1,200 from the federal government to help you through this pandemic time. This was per individual with an additional $500 for a child. It excluded people who made a lot of money, but the levels were so high that you had to be really pretty rich to be excluded from receiving the stimulus payment. So those checks are now in the process of being distributed. Additionally, it made a serious expansion of unemployment insurance, and the value of that is that I literally, while Bob was speaking, a news flash came across my telephone that over 30 million Americans have applied for unemployment insurance, which is a huge number. 25% of workers in Pennsylvania have applied for unemployment insurance. 19% in New Jersey have applied for unemployment insurance. Excuse me. Unemployment insurance in the United States is a program that is operated by both the states and the federal government. So states have limitations on how much they will pay and for how long they will pay. So just to give you an example, the maximum amount that you can receive per week in Pennsylvania is $600. The maximum amount you can receive in Florida is $275. So you see, there's a huge difference. Additionally, there's a maximum amount of time you can receive unemployment insurance by each state, with Florida and other states having a much lower number of weeks than Pennsylvania, for example. Excuse me. The CARES Act modified the unemployment insurance plan to add an additional $600 to everyone who has applied for unemployment insurance. And that $600 per week is on top of whatever the amount is you receive from the state. So if you're in Florida and you're at the maximum amount of $275, you're now going to receive $875. That is a huge influx of money into the system, and that money will be paid through July 31st of 2020. Additionally, the statute expanded the number of weeks that one is eligible for unemployment insurance. So it added an additional 13 weeks. So if in Florida you were only eligible for 12 weeks, it added an additional 13 weeks. In Pennsylvania, you were eligible for 26 weeks. It added an additional 13 weeks to 39 weeks. The other really important thing it did with regards to unemployment insurance is it got rid of what is referred to as the waiting week. So normally when you apply for unemployment insurance, you have to have been unemployed for an entire 7-day period of time. It eliminated the 7-day waiting period. And perhaps the most, one of the more interesting things it did is it made unemployment insurance available to what are referred to as gig workers. These are the folks who are independent contractors, who are self-employed, an Uber driver, someone who delivers food. Here we have Uber Eats or Grubhub, or I'm sure there are equivalent food delivery services not run by a restaurant, but run by a company that contracts with the restaurant to provide delivery of food. It made, or if you're a plumber and you have your own business, suddenly you are now eligible for unemployment insurance. So that was incredibly important. One of the other things it did is it added, it created a program to make money available to small businesses to keep employees on the payroll. It created something called the Paycheck Protection, the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Plan, which essentially, a program, which essentially allows employers to seek a loan that's guaranteed by the federal government of 2.5 times their monthly payroll. And if they get the loan, if they're lucky enough to get the loan and they use that money to keep people on their payroll, the loan will be completely forgiven. So it's essentially a grant from the government. So if you don't spend the money on keeping employees on the payroll, you have to pay the money back. That's all. The only thing that happens to you is it's a regular loan and you have to pay the money back. But if you keep your employees on the payroll so that they're not applying for unemployment insurance, you're going to have that forgiven. There's been a lot of controversy about the plan because although the Congress came up with $3 trillion to fund it, the money ran out very quickly. It was supposed to be for employers who employed fewer than 500 people, but it turned out, because of the way businesses are set up, that some very large publicly traded corporations got the money. There was then embarrassment that they had gotten the money, that it wasn't intended for them, that it was intended for small business, which employs a huge number of people in the United States. And so there's been a lot of controversy about that plan. And recently they just enacted another statute to provide additional money for that plan. So it's pretty extraordinary that Congress has acted as quickly as it has with regards to this legislation to try to protect people and try to protect the income of the families that are out of work without any source of income. I wanted to talk just briefly a little bit about collective bargaining and what has happened with this. And the way collective bargaining has come into play is in the United States, the collective bargaining agreements invariably include provisions having to do with leave, sick leave, vacation leave. They also include provisions having to do with layoffs and when an employer can reduce its force for any number of reasons. Certainly a pandemic would be included in something that most collective bargaining agreements would allow an employer to reduce the force because of a pandemic. With the employee having recall rights, virtually all of the unions have been actively engaged with employers in how to deal with this. Some of the interesting things that have been going on have to do with workers who are currently working. So we represent unions that represent employees who work in grocery stores, and also employees who work in meat processing plants and employees who work in hospitals and nursing homes, all of whom are really badly affected. What the union has been able to do, what the unions have been able to do with regards to grocery stores is to work with their employers to negotiate for limiting the number of people who can come into a store, limiting where people stand in the store, having one person put the items on the conveyor belt rather than having so many people touching the items. One employee standing in the produce section and putting your apples or your tomatoes in a bag rather than everybody touching every apple and every tomato to decide which one they want to purchase. A lot of that came about through collective bargaining. Same thing with food processing plants. You may have heard that a lot of food processing plants have been badly affected by the virus, and that's because people work very closely together. Those are all deemed essential work because it's food and people need food to eat. The unions have been very actively engaged in working with employers in some instances to set up mechanisms of putting up plastic plexiglass between the workers to try to protect them from each other, providing additional personal protection equipment, PPE, to safeguard the employees, making sure that employees' temperatures are taken before they go into work in the morning. All of those things are going on. With regards to the people who work in hospitals, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure that, I don't know that this to be the case in Brazil, but it is certainly the case in the United States. Almost half the cases in the United States are arising in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. And that has a lot to do with the confined spaces that the residents are all in. Also has to do with the advanced age of the individuals in these nursing homes. And so the unions have been engaged in attempting to make sure that there is adequate personal protection equipment to safeguard those employees. I see that I'm running way over my time frame, but I did want to mention one other thing that has become quite important and I think is going to really develop into an issue, and that has to do with workers' compensation. In the United States, as I'm sure in Brazil, if you are injured on the job, you're entitled to medical care and paycheck protection, if you will, while you are injured. There's going to be an entire issue that's going to arise with regards to whether employees who get COVID or are diagnosed with COVID-19 because of the workplace, because of exposure in the workplace, whether that's going to be covered by the Workers' Compensation Act. I don't think there's much question if you are a hospital worker or you work in a meat processing plant or you work in a grocery store and you get COVID-19, that no doubt came about because of your work experience. But to make it clear, a number of states have enacted laws or executive orders to make a presumption that for certain designated job categories, though there will be an assumption that if that employee is diagnosed with COVID-19, that it will be deemed a work-related injury. The employees that I'm thinking about are law enforcement employees, including firefighters and ambulance drivers and police officers and correction officers, additionally healthcare workers. So it's an interesting issue. Currently, there is a debate that has arisen with regards to another bill that may be adopted by Congress to deal with this. And the president of the Senate has suggested that if any additional bills get passed, there have to be some provisions in those bills to exempt employers from any liability if their employees get sick. So this all relates back to workers' compensation. So I will end with that and then be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, can you hear me,
Alain, Sergio is coming.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I ended the translation.
Okay. Yeah, that's Sergio.
So since I'm going to be speaking now, and I'll just pretty much just ask some questions, I will ask a question in English, and then I'll translate it to Portuguese, which will give you some time to think and to answer.
Sure.
Okay. One of the questions I have, first, congratulations for your brilliant lecture now, and all those little details. It's funny because I have about 4 or 5 questions, Alain, and I was aligned to ask, but you already answered them. I was going to ask exactly the one about the responsibility that the employer would have for an employee getting infected and how that is treated, because just this past week, the Brazilian Supreme Court, they thought this article on one of these provisional measures that was edited by our president, which pretty much exempted the responsibility of COVID infections from certain types of work, saying that the presumption that it was not a work-related incident, it was considered unconstitutional by our Supreme Court, which is a very interesting decision that we had. So I was going to ask just about that, but you already answered. But I have another question which I think is very interesting. There was a very big debate, and our Supreme Court here in Brazil ruled over it, but it's still a very interesting debate, and I would like to see your point of view. The Brazilian Constitution, on Article 7, Item 6, it requires collective bargaining for reducing salaries. The only possibility for salary reduction is with collective bargaining. That is what our Item 6 of our Constitution establishes. And we had one of those provisional measures that was given by the Brazilian president, who there was an article which allowed individual negotiation between employee and employer, involving a reduction in salary with a proportional reduction in working hours. And that was there was a big confusion and a lot of debate, because people were saying, well, how can you, through an executive order such as this, go against our Constitution, which requires collective bargaining? And then two political parties took to the Supreme Court. At first, the justice which received the case gave an incidental decision where he thought that that specific article was not unconstitutional, but you would have to give notice to the unions for them to take some sort of action, even if it was just to prefer to become inert and not do anything, but they would have to be notified. But then recently, all 11, or actually it was 10 of our justices of our Supreme Court ruled over it, and by majority they thought it was constitutional, or in other words, there was no offense of the Constitution through this article of this executive order, but they were very clear that it is because of this emergency state that we are in, only because of the pandemic and the situation that we're living right now, is that we can be allowed to put collective bargaining aside and do it with individual negotiation. And so I would just like for you to comment that, if you would have that sort of interpretation there in the U.S. or not. I'm going to translate to Portuguese real fast, okay? Eu perguntei, então, além agora, sobre aquela questão envolvendo a redução do salário a redução proporcional do salário e da jornada de trabalho, que estava prevista na medida provisória 936 aqui no Brasil, e a interpretação, já que nossa Constituição, no artigo 7º, inciso 6º, estabelece a regra geral de que a redução salarial somente pode ocorrer em negociação coletiva. E mencionei a interpretação que foi dada inicialmente, né, pelo relator da ADIM, que chegou ao Supremo, o ministro Lewandowski, e depois a decisão que foi tomada por 10 dos ministros posteriormente. Aí eu estava querendo a opinião dela sobre essa questão envolvendo uma norma constitucional que é objeto de uma conquista após anos e anos e anos de luta, e é uma interpretação acerca, né, da sua validade e da validade de uma norma infraconstitucional que, né, aos olhos de alguns, estaria, então, em choque com a norma constitucional, mas esclarecendo que o nosso Supremo entendeu que, em virtude da situação emergencial na qual se encontra, seria possível, então, interpretar como constitucional essa norma. Eu só queria que ela comentasse isso para ela poder, então, compartilhar a sua opinião. Ok, Alain, go ahead. Speak, then I'll translate.
That's a really interesting concept. We certainly don't have anything similar in our Constitution with regards to dealing specifically with collective bargaining. But what we do have in the United States Constitution is a provision which prohibits Congress or any legislative body from impairing the right to contract. So you can't enter into a contract and then Congress at a later point in time can't go in and invalidate that contract or invalidate a provision of that contract. So if this were to happen in the United States, say they wanted to reduce people's salaries because they wanted everybody to keep working, say it's a hospital, and so they wanted everyone to keep working because they were essential workers, but we're only going to pay you 75% of what we agreed to pay you as opposed to 100% of what we agreed to pay you. If they were my clients, I would advise them to go into court and get an injunction against that happening, because I don't believe that the state or the federal government can pass a law that impairs my existing contract. So realistically, I just don't think that would happen. I mean, there are other mechanisms to deal with issues like that, but I don't think that they could unilaterally reduce the wages by legislation. All of these are very much public relations related and political science issues, if you will, where if they need to be able to keep providing the service, I mean, the reason they're reducing the compensation is because it's presumably essential work that's being done, and so they need that work to continue to be done, but for some reason they can't continue to pay them at the normal rates. If most in a situation like that, many unions would want to try to find some common ground with the employer, saying, well, if we did this, then what will you do for us? Will you give us, when the pandemic is over, will you make up the money at a later point in time? Will you give people an additional time off? Will you give them additional vacation time? Will you, somehow find a way to compensate them for it? So often, although you've got a legal argument to be made that something can't happen, practically you're really in a position of how do you negotiate so that it doesn't look like the union and the workers are just being difficult, if you will.
Okay, I'm translate now. Eu vou fazer uma tradução bem concisa do exposto. Bem, primeiro, ela disse que a Constituição americana ela não trata de questões envolvendo direitos trabalhistas como a brasileira. Então, não há nenhuma previsão na Constituição em relação à questão da possibilidade de redução salarial apenas por meio de negociação coletiva. Ela diz que acha um conceito muito interessante. Nos Estados Unidos, prevalece a ideia de que o legislador ele não pode interferir em contratos que estão em curso. Então, ela disse que se algum cliente dela, cliente tanto individual como algum sindicato, viesse a ser impactado porque passasse uma lei diminuindo, por exemplo, o valor do salário, ou então, se o próprio empregador dissesse, olha, eu vou reduzir o salário porque eu não estou em condições de pagar aquilo que eu originalmente pactuei com você, ela levaria isso para a corte, ela ingressaria em juízo, buscaria uma tutela provisória, ela mencionou um injunction, para impedir que ocorresse essa respectiva redução. Agora, estaria aberto o sindicato a, levando em consideração esses impactos, até talvez possibilitar uma redução, desde que fossem apresentados motivos razoáveis dentro da situação emergencial, mas sempre estabelecendo condições para que houvesse uma posterior compensação. Ela mencionou, olha, em virtude da situação atual, a empresa está, então, sem condições de pagar o que originalmente impactou, porque os negócios acabaram. Então, de repente, havendo uma diminuição, né, proporcional, mas com a promessa de que não, voltaremos depois ao patamar anterior e mais isso, e mais alguma outra vantagem. Ou seja, ela diz que é muito comum, então, na negociação, você buscar, então, bom senso, entender o outro lado, e se você ceder em parte do que aquilo que o outro lado está pedindo, você também peça, né, uma compensação, que às vezes pode ser uma compensação que só virá posteriormente, quando eventualmente, por exemplo, essa fase se encerrar. Então, foi mais ou menos essa a ótica que ela quis estabelecer. Eu agora vou fazer uma pergunta para ela, e vou deixar ela falar, e depois eu faço a tradução, envolvendo algo que me interessa bastante. Eu tenho, como a maior parte dos colegas aqui sabem, eu tenho boa parte da minha família que mora nos Estados Unidos, 3 irmãos que trabalham lá, e conversando com eles, uma das preocupações que eles demonstraram, que eu também tenho, envolve questões do que vai vir posteriormente, depois, decorrentes de todo o estresse, de toda a pressão que alguns trabalhadores, especialmente aqueles, como ela menciona, os first responders, que são aqueles que vão lá para a ação, os médicos, os enfermeiros, enfermeiras, as médicas, os policiais, o estresse que eles vão ter que vai se manifestar posteriormente. Eu vou perguntar a ela se eles já pensam, então, em como será tratada essa questão, se haverá uma responsabilização, eventualmente, do empregador decorrente desse estresse pós-traumático que essas pessoas, eventualmente, vão sofrer em virtude dos momentos de tensão que estão vivendo agora. Eu tenho essa curiosidade, eu vou fazer essa pergunta a ela, ok? Elaine, I'm just curious about one thing. You were talking about worker compensation for an eventual accident that occurred in the labor place, or if they got infected by the COVID virus. Is there any talk about what could happen, or do you have any precedents to say how this is going to be handled? Well, because what was worrying me was like, the post-stress syndrome, where after you like when you come back from a war, that with some of our soldiers have. I'm pretty sure that the war scenes that we are seeing now, with all these people infected and so all these dying, they are really going to affect, especially our first responders and our medics and our nurses. Is there some sort of precedent on how this is going to be treated? Will it be possible to respond to make the employer responsible for this sort of treatment that the person might need?
Well, again, that's going to depend very much on a state-by-state basis, because workers' compensation is, in fact, purely a product of state law within that particular state. Generally speaking, claims like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is a set, and I think you're completely right. I mean, we have certainly anyone who has worked in a situation where there are so many people dying that they're stacking bodies up in refrigerated trucks to take them to the county medical examiner, which is what's happening in New York. I mean, those people have to be very seriously impacted by that. Claims for mental claims, if you will, mental health claims, are generally very hard claims to establish, and that has everything to do with how causation. What is it that caused this particular claim? So people who work in very stressful jobs, there's often an issue of, well, are you mentally disabled because of the stress of your job, or are you mentally disabled because you were, for other reasons that have nothing to do with your job? So why is it that one person doesn't get post-traumatic stress disorder and somebody else does? So those workers' compensation claims are always very difficult. What will be interesting will be in the states that pass presumptions, that enact legislation for presumptions for certain employees. It'll be interesting to see how those will be impacted, because I think the thought was behind those, if somebody shows up with COVID-19, okay, we're gonna automatically assume that's a work-related injury. What they're not talking about is what happens with the consequences there at a later point in time. Although these presumption bills have been passed in other instances involving cancer, for example. So there was a bill passed a couple of years ago in Pennsylvania that if you're a firefighter and you subsequently get cancer, there's going to be a presumption that you got that cancer was related to your being a firefighter. Now that is being challenged, because they're saying, well, wait a second, you have melanoma on your face from being out in the sun. You didn't get that from being a firefighter, but, we'll find out. So it's, the presumption bills, I think, will answer some of that question. So I don't think I could answer you directly, but.
There is a bill there's a bill in Congress now?
No, it's each state by state.
Oh, okay.
State by state, every single state. So if you're in a state like Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New York or Illinois or California, that's very worker friendly, you're going to have much more success than if you're in a state like Mississippi or Florida or where there's not such, they're not prone to look at workers in a friendly fashion.
Okay. Ela falou que depende muito do Estado. Ela disse que essa questão envolvendo a responsabilização não é disciplinada no plano federal. Então, ela disse que vai depender de Estado por Estado. Já existem alguns Estados algum projeto de lei em tramitação que já está tratando não apenas de questões de responsabilização civil por estar infectado do Covid durante o exercício da função, mas também já prevendo algumas hipóteses para o período posterior, inclusive esses traumas que eventualmente as pessoas que lidam diretamente com essas situações de alta tensão, de morte, de doença, que elas podem sofrer. Então, ela tem muita curiosidade, mas vai depender muito de Estado para Estado. Agora, eu vou fazer uma pergunta que eu acho interessante, que eu tenho essa curiosidade. Já que muitos estão trabalhando remotamente agora, né, essas normas trabalhistas que variam de Estado para Estado, se elas serão definidas pelo local onde o empregado hoje, pelo trabalhador remoto, o teletrabalho, está executando suas funções, ou pelo local onde ele originalmente trabalhava, ou então se é pela sede da empresa. Eu tenho uma curiosidade para saber quais são a incidência das normas materiais. I have a question for you, which is curious to me. Okay, let's imagine that I was working in Pennsylvania, okay, at someplace there, and then the pandemic crisis came, and then the place where I worked at was closed because of social distancing. but I'm working now at home. But where I'm working at home, I live in New Jersey. Okay, so I'm now working in New Jersey, and I work 6 months or a year in New Jersey. The rules that will apply to me, will they be the rules in Pennsylvania, where I was originally contracted and where I was working? Or since I've been working at home, the same employee in New Jersey, will the rules that apply to me be the ones that are currently valid in New Jersey? Which one? How would you do that?
The state where you're employed. So the mere fact that you're working in another state doesn't make unless that business is also licensed to operate in another state. So if you had a business that, then it might be a little bit different. But if you're just working at home, you'd be covered by Pennsylvania. You're working at home in your house in New Jersey, but you're employed in Pennsylvania and your employer's in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania law will dictate.
Ok. Ela falou, então, que é a legislação em vigor no local, né, onde o seu empregador estava licenciado para exercer a atividade empresarial. Então, eu dei um exemplo aí, eu trabalhava na Pensilvânia, e aí, então, me transformei em teletrabalhador agora, devido a essa crise, vou trabalhar 6 meses, 1 ano, 2 anos lá, e aí, de repente, quando eu quero ver as normas serão aplicadas a mim, serão as normas, minha residência era na Nova Jersey, e se eu passei a morar lá, se seriam as normas laborais em vigor na Nova Jersey ou se seriam umas normas trabalhistas em vigor na Pensilvânia. Ela disse não, será pelo local do seu empregador, pelo local da base onde você trabalhava. Ela disse, a não ser que no seu caso você trabalhasse para um empregador que era licenciado para trabalhar, né, em vários estados, e dentro desse contexto, né, você prestava serviços para ele naquele outro estado onde ela também estava licenciada para trabalhar. Mas em princípio seria pelo local onde se localiza a sede da empresa para a qual você prestava serviço. Okay, that was really interesting, because the rules here are pretty much where you execute your work, your labor, and so we are having some difficulties in terms about deciding on cases involving what we call home office and teleworkers, telelabor, teleemployees, and that sort of thing.
One of the really interesting issues is I was talking to someone the other day who works for a very large employer in human relations for a very large employer, and that employer had taken the position historically that you could not work from home, that if somebody wanted an accommodation for a disability, that they should be able to work from home, so many days a week. That employer's position was always, this is an office-based environment. You need to come into the office. We're not going to accommodate you to work from home. Now, with the coronavirus, that we've now established that we've got millions of people working from home, lawyers, for example, who are all working from home, query how that's now going to work out with all these employers who have said, oh, you can't work from home. You have to come to the office. Even though you could arguably do your job at home, you must physically be present in our offices if you have a disability that requires you to work from home. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, you can't just say, I want to work from home because I want to practice law in my pajamas, as opposed to I need to work from home because I have a disability that requires me to be in a place with certain air filters because of my asthma, or, I don't know, I'm like making this up, but I think that one of the things that's happened is lots of businesses that never thought they could operate from home are all operating from home.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is fun.
Yeah,
I'm going to translate that. Marcelo, go ahead. Marcelo?
It's just a short question. Here in Brazil, the government is like supplementing the salaries of the workers. So the company pays half, and the government pays the other half. Mm-hmm. In some cases, is there such a in the United States, something like that, by a support by the federal or the state government to pay the salary?
Let me just translate real fast. Okay? Vou traduzir rapidamente aqui. Ela só observou uma coisa interessante, ela disse que foi muito engraçado, ela está achando, porque muitos empregadores sempre tinham resistência a admitir que seus empregados trabalhassem em casa, exigindo, não, tem que trabalhar aqui dentro, venha para a empresa. E agora estão vendo que os empregados podem trabalhar nas suas próprias casas. Ela acha que vai ser interessante, quando isso tudo acabar, voltar, então, à discussão, porque muitas vezes os empregados queriam trabalhar em casa, especialmente aqueles que tinham alguma dificuldade. Ela mencionou que alguém que tem asma e que precisa, então, de uma filtragem de ar, queria trabalhar em casa, o empregador não queria deixar, mas só que agora está trabalhando em casa sem maiores problemas, está conseguindo. Ela mencionou essa curiosidade. E o Marcelo perguntou, eu esqueci, Marcelo, a pergunta foi sobre a questão
Sim, a pergunta que eu fiz foi que aqui no Brasil você tem um suporte do governo pagando metade dos salários, né? E se nos Estados Unidos isso ocorre também, se é no nível federal ou no nível estadual, se há esse tipo de suporte governamental em relação às questões, principalmente no caso da Flórida, por exemplo.
Certo. Okay.
That was my question. I was translating here my question for the...
Marcelo, the thing that has come closest is this Paycheck Protection Program, this PPP program, where companies, companies can apply for a loan from they go to a bank and apply for a loan. The loan is guaranteed by the federal government. You get a loan for 2.5 times your monthly payroll for the month of March of last year. And as long as the employer keeps those employees on the payroll, that loan will be completely forgiven. So the money that's going back to employers, so this is a program to try to incentivize employers to keep employees on the payroll rather than lay them off. And with if you get one of these PPP loans, that loan then becomes basically a grant. Now, that only helps if you're trying to keep people on the payroll for like hospitals and things like that are operating now, but still losing vast amounts of money. I mean, one of the things that is ironic in the United States is that there are other businesses where they're open, but they're losing money, like hospitals, because hospitals had to eliminate all elective surgeries. So if you were going to have your gallbladder removed, or I don't know, I can't think of another, you had a valve replacement that was scheduled. So you've got a heart condition, it's not an emergency, they scheduled the surgery for March 15th. All those have been eliminated. And that's how hospitals make the vast majority of their money. So the hospitals, particularly in areas, pretty much across the board, hospitals are really suffering huge financial losses because all those, they may have COVID patients, but the rest of the hospital is empty.
O Marcelo perguntou essa pergunta com relação à ajuda. Ela mencionou aquele PPP, que é aquele empréstimo com o objetivo de manter a folha de pagamento. E ela mencionou, como ela tinha falado, ela disse, se utilizar para esse fim, esse empréstimo será perdoado, né, que pode ser, então, 2,5 vezes a folha salarial de março, de março, foi desse ano, do ano passado, se não me engano, pelo que ela mencionou. Só que ela mencionou que alguns setores estão sofrendo muito, e ela citou o exemplo dos hospitais, eles estão perdendo muito dinheiro. E ela explicou, não, estão atendendo os pacientes com Covid, mas outras cirurgias que geravam mais renda para todo esse setor, né? As cirurgias eletivas, assim, que você quiser fazer, elas estão, então, proibidas. Os hospitais não estão fazendo. Aí você tem um hospital cheio naquele setor que pode oferecer o tratamento para os pacientes de Covid, mas para o outro setor completamente vazio e sofrendo, então, né, esse grande prejuízo. Agora, eu vou fazer uma pergunta para ela que eu acho que interessa boa parte da plateia, os advogados e os juízes estão assistindo. Eu vou perguntar como é que está sendo operacionalizado agora, né, essa atuação dos advogados e dos juízes. Eles estão fazendo audiências telepresenciais ou presenciais mesmo. Não apenas a Alain é advogada, mas os 2 filhos deles são advogados atuantes. Então, só para ter essa curiosidade lá no estado, se elas estão indo para audiências ou se estão fazendo absolutamente tudo remoto e as audiências estão suspensas. Alain, most of our public is made up of judges and lawyers, and so we're just curious. You said both your children are lawyers now, right?
Well, actually, my daughter, my son, and my daughter-in-law, so all 3 of them are lawyers.
Okay. O filho, a filha e a nora, todos são advogados. Are they going to court? How are they working? They doing everything remote?
So those who do civil law, no, they are not going to court. Because the courts are only operating for emergencies. My daughter-in-law does child protective services. So she works with the state of New Jersey, where the government is taking a child away from a family because they believe that the child is endangered. And she is doing hearings in court. It's all being done electronically. So she's practicing from her kitchen table, sitting, and all the witnesses are appearing by way of Zoom. And I don't exactly know how, I haven't quite figured out how they get the witnesses in, who arranges for that to happen, but she has not been in open court since Friday, March 13th was the last date she was in open court. And all the courts have been completely closed. There are oral arguments going on. So the courts, all the district courts and the federal courts are allowing lawyers to argue motions, but all electronically. And in the United States Supreme Court, I think this starts on Monday, or maybe it started last Monday. They're going to go back to having oral argument, and it's going to be done by telephone. But all of my daughter-in-law's hearings have all been by Zoom, with the judge appearing by Zoom, and all electronic.
Criminal cases
criminal arraignments also, they're all occur to the extent that anything has to happen quickly. It's all being done electronically by Zoom. All trials have been postponed, and the Supreme Court issued an order. The state Supreme Court issued an order, postponing all the quick trial rules and things like that, and freezing statutes of limitations for a period of time. There's reason to believe that some of that's going to go back into play quite soon, because the state courts were shut down much quicker than the federal courts did. Federal courts have continued to function to a large extent, but it's interesting, you can go in for emergencies, but you must actually, if you're going to file something as an emergency, you must go to the courthouse. Now you can file everything electronically. All your papers are filed electronically. You rarely go to the courthouse for a filing of anything. If you want an emergency action, you actually have to show up at the courthouse with those papers. So I think it's just sort of an extra push that this really better be an emergency.
Okay. I want to translate now, and then I'm just going to give everyone just about a minute to give like a closing statement, okay?
Great.
I'll translate now.
Great.
Vou fazer essa tradução então dessa resposta. Ela disse que o filho, a filha e a nora são advogados militantes, mas estão trabalhando diretamente de casa, tudo por teleconferência, tudo remotamente. Ela diz, hoje em dia, no estado lá da Pensilvânia, a Suprema Corte do Estado estabeleceu que somente questões urgentes poderiam ser realizadas de forma presencial. Aí, então, ela disse, se for uma situação absolutamente urgente, aí, então, o advogado tem que se deslocar lá, inclusive levar aquela documentação para pedir uma audiência com o respectivo juiz, e aí, então, ter esse contato direto presencial. Mas a regra é que tudo tem sido feito por teleconferência. Ela mencionou a utilização do aplicativo Zoom, e ela mencionou, inclusive, que a Suprema Corte americana, pela primeira vez, vai ter sustentações orais feitas pelo telefone, né? Eu também tinha obtido essa informação. Não é Zoom, não, é pelo telefone mesmo, literalmente, haverá essa apresentação. Então, né, essa curiosidade. Nós estamos entrando nessa nova fase de atos com teleconferência em primeiro grau. Nós vamos entrar agora nesse mês de maio. Então, a experiência lá tem sido, né, aproximada. Ela diz que realmente não sabe detalhes que seriam uma curiosidade com relação a como são ouvidas testemunhas e etc. Só que o sistema americano também é diferenciado, ele permite uma maior liberdade com relação à produção de prova testemunhal do que aqui no Brasil. Então, a resposta dela foi nesse sentido. Eles estão trabalhando mesmo, né, de casa, utilizando, então, teleconferência. Então, nós temos, chegando ao nosso finalzinho da previsão do nosso tempo, então eu vou dar a palavra, então, primeiro ao professor Robert, depois a Alain, por fim, ao Marcelo, para eles fazerem suas considerações finais, algo curto, assim, um fechamento para cada um deles. Okay, Robert, like I was saying, maybe you have like a minute just to look at a closing statement of what you thought was important and what you would like to emphasize here.
Well, I think it's important for those of us in countries that are organized according to federalism to understand that sometimes federalism is efficient and helps us deal with problems. Other times it's not efficient, and sometimes it gets in the way of response to problems. There are a lot of good reasons for having federalism, but usually one of them is not that you have a lot of efficiency in dealing with problems. So to me, I'm very happy to see mostly cooperation in the United States between the states and the federal government, but I'm unhappy to see the competition and the controversy between the states and the federal government. But the last thing I'd say is a pandemic like this could result in a lot of very serious violence and outbreaks of looting and things like that. And to the extent we can keep these controversies within the realm of law, we're all going to be a lot better off. But we have a long ways to go, and we're going to see how these things play out. Thank you.
Well, we have to thank you, Robert. It's wonderful, wonderful having you here. You just don't understand. It was really, 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 really great. Really great. The translation. O Robert finalizou dizendo que o que ele acha importante no que ele destacou é que dentro do sistema de federalismo, como nós temos aqui no nosso país, ele acha interessante que você tem os dois lados. Você tem a competição de um lado, às vezes, entre os estados e o governo, e às vezes entre os próprios estados, e você tem um lado da cooperação, eles trabalhando juntos, enfrentando um mesmo problema, querendo, então, o mesmo fim. Aí ele tem gostado muito da cooperação e tem ficado um pouco triste com essa competição, tanto no plano horizontal como vertical. Ele queria ver minimizado isso para se enfatizar mais o cooperativismo que ele tem visto de forma positiva, né? E ele demonstrou preocupação, disse, olha, numa situação, numa pandemia dessa, você tem risco de atos violentos, né, que nós não temos visto ainda, espero que não passamos a ver, mas há um perigo de revolta, de revolução. E é muito importante que esses conflitos, que porventura venham a existir, seja no plano individual ou coletivo, eles sejam resolvidos dentro do devido processo legal, dentro do rule of law, né, dentro de um sistema que permite que, de forma civilizada, esses eventuais conflitos sejam solucionados. Aí eu, então, agradeci a ele pela sua apresentação, que foi uma grande honra. Robert, it was an incredible honor for the Judicial School and for our postgraduate in law program at the Catholic University to have you. Very, very, very touched. Very wonderful.
Thank you. The honor is ours.
Okay. Alain, your closing statement?
I just want to say it was really an interesting opportunity to do this program today. I'm really, in many ways, this has been such a difficult time for us in the United States, but I am really very encouraged that our Congress, which often doesn't get along with each other very well, the parties being quite split, that they have managed to pass legislation that was designed to help working men and women. And I think that's a really good thing because, there are a lot of people out of work, and it's certainly through no fault of their own. So it's just nice to see that that the political system was such that it could rally around this issue to try to help each other. And I hope that things in Brazil improve, just as I hope they improve in the United States, and that before long we've come up with a vaccine and we can return to life that we once knew, and all your children can go back to school and we can go back to restaurants and shopping in stores, and our hospital and healthcare workers can go back to not being so incredibly overworked. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, we thank you. It was wonderful hearing you too, Elaine. We have a lot of labor lawyers and labor judges watching, so it was very, very interesting to see this different point of view of a different reality and how it relates to our country. Ela, então, agradeceu muito. Ela disse que foi um privilégio participar de um evento internacional como esse, e o que ela destaca, o que ela tem visto de melhor no cenário norte-americano, ela disse que é uma cooperação dentro do Poder Legislativo entre parlamentares dos dois partidos, né? Basicamente nos Estados Unidos é o Partido Republicano e o Partido Democratas, e surpreendeu elas trabalhando juntos para editar uma série de leis que buscam ajudar, né, os trabalhadores e as trabalhadoras. Isso tem sido, então, algo fantástico para ela, e ela espera, então, que essa fase difícil venha passar rapidamente para que as nossas crianças, nossos filhos possam voltar à escola, para que possamos voltar a conviver socialmente, ir para restaurantes. É isso que ela espera, então, que amanhã seja um dia melhor, né? Eu agradeci a ela também pela exposição, né, realmente legal, especialmente para o juiz do trabalho e para advogados trabalhistas, que são uma boa parte do nosso público aqui. E agora eu passo a palavra ao meu querido amigo e irmão Marcelo Labanca, ex-coordenador geral do PPGD da Universidade Católica de Pernambuco, procurador do Banco Central, né, um excelente docente, um ser humano melhor ainda. Marcelo.
Sérgio, sempre generoso, né, Sérgio? Eu falo em inglês essa minha última parte, né? Was very interesting, Bob and Elaine, this dialogue. I think we have many problems that they are the same, but also we have some solutions that we can share. And despite this distance, I think a good way for us to go ahead is being together. And this opportunity, it's a good initiative to show that we can, despite the distance and with words, we can be together and think about and stay together at home, but together, and think about solutions to this huge problem that we are facing. So thank you very much, and I'm very looking forward to see you both again here in Brazil.
Great.
Obrigado.
Você pode fazer a tradução, mas eu faço uma traduçãozinha rápida do que você falou.
Sim. O que eu I'm going to translate to Portuguese for o que eu disse foi que a gente tem muitos problemas que são problemas comuns entre os dois países, né, mas que também existem soluções que a gente pode dividir. E que, apesar da distância, uma das boas formas de a gente conseguir atravessar todos esses problemas é exatamente nós permanecermos juntos, né? Essa iniciativa, por exemplo, ela é uma demonstração disso, de que a gente pode estar juntos e, a partir daí, pensarmos juntos em soluções para os problemas que a gente está literalmente enfrentando. Tudo é uma novidade, né? Então, agora que nós temos com a tecnologia, né? Quer dizer, não tão facilidade assim, mas com certeza vai encurtar distâncias. Foi isso. E agradecer a Sérgio, né, que é muito generoso, né, Sérgio? Obrigado, Sérgio.
Pronto. Pronto, eu vou falar rapidamente em inglês, aí eu fecho em português. Okay, I'm going to speak in English and I'll do the closing in Portuguese. I want to thank the both of you once again. It was incredible, an incredible experience. I'm sure that hundreds of judges, hundreds of lawyers had a really great afternoon, learned a lot. I certainly learned a lot. I really, really did. And it was just wonderful to have this cooperation that we need to have in times like this, difficult times where we have to face all these obstacles, and to count with people like Marcelo, like Elaine, like Robert, that it just makes everything so much easier, so much easier. So with all my heart, I thank you. It was a great honor for our law program and our judicial school to have you today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Agradeci a eles, dizendo que foi muito importante ter essa cooperação internacional que nós vimos hoje, com dois grandes nomes do direito norte-americano, tanto na advocacia como no âmbito do direito constitucional, contando aqui o local com o Marcelo, agradecendo mesmo de coração. Eu quero novamente registrar o agradecimento a quem está nos bastidores, vocês não estão vendo agora, mas o Rodrigo Samico está aqui, mandando mensagem de vez em quando, está tudo certo, aqui é um minuto, Sérgio, vê isso. Também, o Pedro também, o Cid também que está aqui, toda a equipe da Escola Judicial ajudou muito, e assumo toda a responsabilidade pelas essas falhas técnicas e peço perdão a todos, especialmente por aquela primeira falha com relação à tradução no meu Insta. Espero que tenha sido pelo menos razoável e agradeço mesmo a presença de todos. Foi um imenso prazer estar aqui. Esse foi apenas o primeiro de uma série. Nós vamos ter um novo evento envolvendo diálogos internacionais do PPGD e da Escola Judicial do TRT, na quinta-feira que vem, já dia 7. Nós vamos estar junto com duas professoras do Boston College, que vão tratar, então, de acesso à justiça em épocas de pandemia. Um estudo comparativo Estados Unidos e Brasil. Nesse mesmo formato, acredito que vai ser um pouco melhor. Espero que a tradução esteja melhor para vocês e mais fácil da próxima vez. Eu vou tentar, então, me atualizar em relação a essas novas tecnologias para não cometer os erros que eu cometi hoje. Ok, doutores? Agradeço a todos, a Escola Judicial, na pessoa do seu diretor, Ivan Valença, ao PPGD, agora na pessoa do seu ex-coordenador aqui, o Marcelo, e agradeço. Muito obrigado, Robert. Muito obrigado, Alain. Até então, mas vamos fechar aqui agora. Obrigado a todos. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau.
Bye, bye.